Hello and welcome to another edition of Foreign Dispatches here on Channels Television. I'm Teniola Shobowale. On the program this week, Afghanistan declared an Islamic emirate as Taliban announces new government. The Taliban has announced an interim government in Afghanistan, declaring the country an Islamic emirate. The list of cabinet members is dominated by members of the group's old guard, with no women included. Let's take a closer look.
The Taliban announced its new government on Tuesday, naming Mullah Hassan Akhund, an associate of the movement's late founder Mullah Omar, as acting prime minister. Akhund was the foreign minister and then deputy prime minister during the Taliban's rule in the late 90s. Mullah Abdul Ghani Barada will be deputy. Barada was responsible for attacks on coalition forces, according to the United Nations, and served 8 years in prison in Pakistan. Later, he became one of the group's most prominent political leaders in the peace talks with the United States. The new interior minister will be Sirajuddin Haqqani, son of the founder of the Haqqani Network, which is designated as a terrorist organization by the United States. Haqqani is one of the FBI's most wanted men due to his involvement in suicide attacks and ties with Al-Qaeda. The U.S. State Department has offered a reward of up to $10 million for information leading to his arrest. The Taliban have repeatedly sought to reassure Afghans and foreign countries that they will not return to the brutality of their last reign 2 decades ago, marked by punishments and the barring of women and girls from public office. But Tuesday's announcement that a group of established Taliban figures will be filling prominent governing roles did not appear to signal a brand new start. No Women's Affairs Minister has been announced, and there are no women named in the interim cabinet.
Will not forget what you did in a pivotal moment.
The U.S. has expressed concern that the interim government includes figures linked to attacks on U.S. forces, and the EU said the Islamist group had reneged on promises to make it inclusive and representative. Following the announcement by the Taliban, the UN said only a negotiated and inclusive settlement will bring sustainable peace to Afghanistan.
As you know, the UN Secretariat and the UN doesn't engage in acts of recognition of governments. That's a matter that's done by member states, not by us. From our standpoint regarding today's announcement, only a negotiated and inclusive settlement will bring sustainable peace to Afghanistan. The United Nations remains committed to contribute to a peaceful solution, promote the human rights of all Afghans, notably women and girls, promote sustainable development in line with Agenda 2030, and provide life-saving humanitarian assistance and critical support to civilians in need.
But some countries have taken a softer approach. Pakistan's foreign minister, speaking at a virtual conference that brought together neighbors Pakistan, China, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Iran, and Turkmenistan to discuss Afghan strategy, floated the idea of inviting the new rulers in Kabul to future gatherings.
I also suggest that we may give consideration to the idea to invite Afghanistan in future. Participation of Afghanistan will augment this forum's effectiveness in pursuing our shared objectives for lasting peace and stability in Afghanistan. We all are grappling with a changed reality in Afghanistan. The Taliban have announced formation of a caretaker setup. We have noted this development. We hope that the political situation stabilizes at the earliest, leading to normalcy. The new situation requires discarding old lenses, developing new insights, and proceeding with a realistic and pragmatic approach. At the center of our endeavors must remain the well-being of the Afghan people, who have suffered enormously due to conflict and instability for over 40 years.
Also taking a softer approach, China said it welcomed the end of what it calls 3 weeks of anarchy in Afghanistan, with the establishment of a new interim government in Kabul, calling on the Taliban to restore order in the country.
China attaches importance to the Taliban's announcement of the formation of an interim government and arrangement of some key roles. This is an essential step for Afghanistan to restore domestic order and pursue post-war reconstruction. China's position on the Afghan issue is consistent and clear. We always respect Afghanistan's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity, adhere to non-interference in its internal affairs, and support the Afghan people to independently choose a development path suited to the country's conditions.
While much of the world has adopted a wait-and-see approach to engagement with the Taliban, China has already said it's ready to build friendly relations with the group following their takeover.
Despite the threat of violent beatings and retaliation, hundreds of women marched in the streets of Kabul on Tuesday, calling for the Taliban to respect their rights and making it clear that they would not easily surrender the gains they have made over the past 2 decades. But as the crowds grew, with the women joined by hundreds of men, the Taliban responded with warning shots.
Women have been protesting for the past week, but on Tuesday, men also joined their calls for equality and safety. Hundreds of protesters took to the streets of Kabul to denounce the Taliban rule and demand women's rights. Protesters also chanted anti-Pakistan slogans, as many believe neighboring Pakistan supports the Taliban, which the country denies. The Taliban responded by firing gunfire into the air. Scores of people were seen running for cover as volleys of gunfire could be heard. Guards at a nearby bank opened its basement car park to dozens of women who sheltered from the gunfire for about 20 minutes. These protests are the biggest challenge to the Taliban's authority in Kabul so far and include bold and direct criticism of the group. The demonstrations come a day after Ahmed Massoud, the leader of anti-Taliban fighters in Afghanistan's Panjshir Valley, called for a national uprising by civilians against the militants. Many protesters showed support for the resistance fighters, who claim are still fighting off the Taliban in Panjshir. Taliban on Monday claimed victory in the province, the final pocket of territory which has remained outside their rule. The militants who swept to power last month as the United States withdrew its troops after a 20-year war banned girls and women from schools and most work when they last ruled the country from 1996 to 2001. The group has now said women will be allowed to work across important sectors of society in line with Islamic law, and their rights will be protected.
Meanwhile, speaking of women's rights, students across Afghanistan have started returning to university classrooms after the Taliban stormed to power. And in some classes, females have been separated from their male peers by curtains or boards down the middle of the room.
Afghan students resumed classes this week to recent changes segregating female students in class and partly restricting their access to campus. Females sit on one side while male students sit on the other side, separated by curtains. Many students, both male and female, are unhappy with the new normal.
All I have to say to the Taliban is, do not create problems and challenges in the field of education so that we can carry on with our educational activities and employment like we used to in the past.
Our request to the Taliban is not to be so strict and not to impose extremist laws on people.
Despite assurances in recent weeks from the Taliban that women's rights will be honored in accordance with Islamic law, it is unclear what that will mean in practice. Their return to power has alarmed some women who fear they will lose the rights they fought for in the last 2 decades in the face of resistance from many families and officials in the deeply conservative Muslim country. When it last ruled from 1996 to 2001, the group banned girls from school and women from university and work. This week, a document outlining guidelines for resuming class circulated by an association of private universities in Afghanistan listed measures such as mandatory wearing of hijabs and separate entrances for female students. It also said female teachers should be hired to teach female students and that females should be taught separately or in smaller classes segregated by a curtain.
While focus is centered on evacuations and the formation of Afghanistan's new government, many left behind face a desperate situation. International aid agencies have raised the alarm about an impending humanitarian crisis in the country, with the UN saying basic services are collapsing.
Even before the Taliban victory, Afghanistan was heavily aid dependent, with more than a third of the country's gross domestic product drawn from foreign funding. Now, aid agencies warn of an impending humanitarian crisis amid food shortages.
Well, the World Food Programme is managing to deliver quite a lot of food throughout the country because over this last year, even before the political crisis, we've been scaling up the amount of food and nutrition assistance that we're giving in Afghanistan. So actually, it's really quite a large-scale operation that's carrying on, regardless of the turmoil. And this year already, we've reached about 5.8 million people, including some of those newly displaced people, the ones who fled from city to city as the Taliban swept to power, and even people in Kabul. So we are managing to work, but our problem is that it's a big scale up and we need food. We need to truck in food, and that's quite challenging. The latest statistics suggest that 1 in 3 Afghans is going hungry, meaning technically we'd call them food insecure, which means they're struggling from day to day just to get enough food on the table to live a normal life. And that's a lot of people. That's 14 million people.
There is a new reality that our new authorities in Afghanistan, we engage as a humanitarian organization with these authorities as we have in the past more than 3 decades, in order to have an agreement on neutral, impartial, and independent humanitarian assistance, on the programs that we think are important to move forward, on the modalities for humanitarian assistance and protection work in the future. And in that context, it goes without saying that principled humanitarian work, diversity of teams, independent needs assessment, independent recruitment for us as well as for the Afghan Red Crescent Society. These are all issues which are important. I talk about, of course, the women, the children, the displaced, those detained, those released from detention and suffering from psychological and physical harm. These are all issues which were discussed in our conversations with the authorities, local as well as national, and which will be part of ICRC's hopefully increased and fastened response to the needs in Afghanistan.
On Monday, the United Nations appealed for almost $200 million in extra funding for life-saving aid. This means a total of $606 million in aid is now needed for Afghanistan until the end of the year, as the country has been cut off from the international financial institutions and its foreign reserves frozen by the US since the Taliban takeover.
Basic services in Afghanistan are collapsing, and food and other life-saving aid is about to run out. As we heard, the Secretary General has warned of a humanitarian catastrophe. We urge international donors to support this appeal fast and generously. If properly and fully funded, the appeal will deliver the following: critical food and livelihood assistance to nearly 11 million people, essential health services to 3.4 million people, treatment for acute malnutrition for more than 1 million children and women, water, sanitation and hygiene interventions for 2.5 million people, protection, including for children and survivors of gender-based violence for 1.5 million people. There are also projects addressing children's emergency education, as well as shelter and other non-food assistance.
Compounding the crisis, because donors like the World Bank, the European Union and USAID are not allowed to deal with the new Taliban government, hundreds of medical facilities in Afghanistan are also at risk of imminent closure.
I mean, we understand the constraints that the donors work under. They are looking urgently at options, to keep those health facilities open. But we are going to have a pause in operation in a large proportion of those. Probably, by some estimates, up to 90% will cease functioning probably later in the week. Last week, the 15 of the main NGOs who were implementing that project wrote to the Ministry of Health and said, we can no longer continue to support the health facilities after the 5th of September. we will hand back responsibility for those health facilities, for the functioning of those health facilities from the 10th of September.
According to the International Organization for Migration inside Afghanistan, drought and war have forced about 5.5 million people to flee their homes, including more than 550,000 newly displaced in 2021.
When we return in just a moment, we visit Ethiopia's Tigray region as the World Food Programme warns food aid is about to run out. Please stay with us. You're still watching Foreign Dispatches on Channels Television. The World Food Programme says the first delivery in 2 weeks of humanitarian aid to the Tigray province of Ethiopia will last for about 7 days, but much more support is needed. The WFP says supplies of food aid is running out, with millions on the brink of starvation.
Loaded onto backs of camels among the last stocks of food aid in conflict-hit northern Ethiopia, the footage released by the World Food Programme reflects the severe humanitarian situation in Tigray. And it's people like Mother of Six, Letta Mariam, who are paying the price.
I couldn't sleep at night and think straight at day, always thinking about what to feed my kids. I still think about how to provide for them.
Thousands have been killed and more than 2 million forced to flee their homes since war broke out 10 months ago. Now the United Nations warns that a de facto blockade is bringing millions to the brink of famine. The WFP video was filmed at the end of August in northwestern Tigray. Satyan Tate is a WFP staff member in the area.
We don't have any food stocks at the moment to plan with or to distribute. Whatever we have is currently being distributed or has already been distributed. So what we're looking at going forward is a difficult situation for us to keep providing services for our communities here.
More aid has since materialized. 100 trucks covering 3,500 metric tons of food and other supplies arrived on Sunday. But the WFP called that a drop in the ocean and says that 100 trucks are needed to be arriving every day to meet the needs of the population. A spokesperson for Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has dismissed allegations that the Ethiopian government is blocking food aid. The UN has called on all parties to the conflict to allow the movement of supplies into the region. It says 5.2 million people, or 90% of Tigray's population, urgently need humanitarian assistance. That includes 400,000 already facing famine conditions.
And over in West Africa, Guinea is also facing uncertainty following the military takeover of President Alpha Condé this week. The overthrow ends more than a decade in power for a man initially lauded by human rights activists, but later accused of an abuse of power.
A degree of normalcy returned to the streets of Guinea's capital, Conakry, on Monday, the day after a military unit ousted President Alpha Condé. Traffic resumed, albeit through military checkpoints, and some shops reopened around the main administrative district in Kaloum.
Overall, we can say that there is peace in Guinea, because in most regions, including the capital Conakry, we see the people going out for regular and daily activities. We are starting over, and there is no panic resulting from the problem between the government and certain military forces. But for the moment, nothing is certain, nothing has been established.
Conakry on Sunday, September 5th, witnessed heavy gunfire as the Special Forces troops battled soldiers loyal to the president. But having seized control, the elite units now faces the task of maintaining it. Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya, the leader of the unit that removed Condé, gathered government officials together on Monday. They've been barred from leaving the country until further notice.
The General Secretaries of our different departments will ensure services continue until the establishment of the next government. I want to inform you that travel outside our border is not authorized by the transition. All your travel documents and your service vehicles must be returned to your former department's secretariats. A global consultation will be opened in order to explain the major points of the transition. Afterwards, a national unity government will be put in place to drive the transition.
Doumbouya also instructed them to hand back their official vehicles, though he added there will be no witch hunt. In addition, air borders have been reopened and a curfew in mining areas lifted. Guinea has the world's largest reserves of bauxite and ore used in the production of aluminum. Aluminum prices soared on Monday to a 10-year high over fears of supply disruption. The coup has also been met with condemnation from some of Guinea's strongest allies. The United Nations and Nigeria quickly denounced the takeover, and both the African Union and West Africa's regional bloc, ECOWAS, have threatened sanctions. But on the streets of Conakry, some celebrate the military overthrow of President Condé.
It's a victory for the Guinean youth in general. We are really happy. We say, well done to the Guinean army, to the special forces. The youth has won. Today we are free. Everyone is free today.
On Sunday, Doumbouya told state television that poverty and endemic corruption had driven his forces to oust Condé, but uncertainty remains. The coup caps off a dramatic fall from grace for Condé, whose election in 2010 was greeted with optimism by human rights activists and international organizations. The veteran opposition leader and human rights professor was at the time Guinea's most prominent champion of multi-party democracy. Guinea has seen sustained economic growth during Condé's decade in power, thanks to its bauxite, iron ore, gold and diamond wealth. But few of its citizens have seen the benefits, and critics say he failed to live up to his promises of delivering democratic restoration and ethnic reconciliation.
And finally on the program, the race to get everyone vaccinated has led to the introduction of unique initiatives around the world. Last week, we told you about the drive-through vaccination center in South Africa. Now, officials have deployed a vaccination train to inoculate those living in rural communities. Take a look.
The train now standing at Platform 1 could help protect you against COVID-19. With South Africa's inoculation campaign off to a slow start, a locomotive is being deployed to administer vaccines. Last month, vaccinations were made available to all adults as the government ramps up its rollout. The train makes it possible to avoid the long queues that have since formed at vaccination centers.
We've been waiting for this moment for a very long time, especially we work in industries where, you need to be at work like all the time. So it was very crucial for me to get this vaccine.
We are basically bringing the vaccines to the people. So it cuts down on patients having to travel long distances, wait in long queues, and sometimes even be turned back because vaccines are maybe finished or they get to clinics or hospitals late.
The vaccine train is an initiative by state logistics firm Transnet. It's currently parked at Spring Station in South Africa's biggest city, Johannesburg. But in the first week of September, it departs for the rural Eastern Cape. There it will be available to villagers who often don't have access to basic health services.
It's a good initiative because it's a schlep to go and drive and vaccinate. Queue first, vaccinate. So once it's closer, look, as you can see, it was very quick here. I don't think I even spent 20 minutes here. So there should be more of these.
South Africa has been battered by 3 coronavirus waves. Millions have been infected and more than 80,000 have died, by far the continent's heaviest toll. With just 14% of adults fully vaccinated, the government is now aiming for 300,000 inoculations per day. The vaccine train, it's hoped, will help keep that ambition on track.
Well, this is where we say goodbye till next time. Remember, our top stories are never far away. You can catch them on channelstv.com. Thank you so much for watching the program. I'm Tenyola Shoboale. Stay safe.